I have OCD, and it was a mess for me to even figure that out. It took like 10 years, and I went to a bunch of different therapists, and eventually I was just reading a bunch of stuff, and I was like, I think I have OCD.
In my own clinical practice, one of the diagnoses that seems to have been missed by other clinicians a lot is obsessive compulsive disorder. OCD, as far as we know, it's not one thing. In fact, even from a symptom standpoint, it has fuzzy boundaries. So we have to respect that heterogeneity, but it offers us a certain descriptive potential. We can talk about it, we can identify it, we can use it for guiding treatment. And so this would be a good example of something that's very helpful pragmatically. It's an entity that exists from a pragmatic point of view, but not from an essentialistic point of view.
There's a lot of pressure to be able to reduce these things down into a checklist, right? One of the things you're saying is, yeah, you can do the checklist, but really a good clinician has a little bit of like a smell for it. Observing clinicians and then reducing how they operate to diagnostic rules. That's exactly how machine learning researchers started in AI, and it's exactly what didn't work. What ended up working is deep learning. Awais, welcome to the show.
Thanks, Dan. I'm happy to be here.
Happy to have you. So for people who don't know you, you are a psychiatrist. You're also the clinical assistant professor of psychiatry at Case Western Reserve and the editor of Conversations in Critical Psychiatry. And for people who are listening or watching who are like, why are you on AI Die? Yeah. I promise there's an explanation. In particular, for anyone who's been a listener of the show for a while, I've been really obsessed with how AI might change science and in particular, how it might change psychology, psychiatry, neuroscience, more complex areas of science where science has historically struggled. And while you don't write specifically about AI, I've been reading your Substack for a while, and we'll link to the Substack in the show notes. And I love it, and I love your perspective, and I just feel like there's a lot of overlap in some of the things that we've been thinking about, and I wanted to understand more about your ideas, and talk through some of the AI stuff and see if you think I'm crazy or not.
That sounds great.
Cool. So I think if I had to pinpoint one of the things that I like most about your work is I think most people who work in psychology or psychiatry doing research want to come up with a single theory that's like depression is anger turned inward, or it's serotonin imbalance, or it's this or it's that. I think those kinds of single theories are quite valuable. I think it's the intellectual lineage of them, which we can sort of trace back to like physics and stuff, makes a lot of sense, but they haven't worked that well in the domains that you care about, the domains that I care about. And I think you tend to advocate for something called explanatory pluralism. So the idea that when we're working in a domain like psychiatry, you have to bring to bear multiple different perspectives to really get a sense for the thing that you're trying to understand. Can you unpack that a little bit more for us?
Yes, yeah, and I'm glad to hear that this is an idea that has resonated with you quite a bit. And one of the things that I've been trying to do is to promote more pluralistic thinking in psychiatry and clinical psychology. And I think that there are two ways we can understand this idea of pluralistic kind of thinking. One is kind of takes inspiration from this general philosophical attitude, what we call scientific pluralism, that things can be explained even within the realm of science through a variety of different theoretical perspectives that rely on different assumptions, different background kind of ideas, and that each perspective might offer certain theoretical advantages or empirical advantages, but there isn't necessarily one single correct true perspective, but things are multifaceted, and that multifaceted nature is not captured by one theoretical kind of perspective. And this applies particularly in situations where phenomena do not possess a singular essence. When something possesses a hidden property that makes it what it is, kind of often identifying that essence is the single best way of characterizing that. I mean, I think a good example of that would be the periodic table of elements in chemistry. It captures something really, very real and objective about the structure of elements, their atomic, the way their atomic nuclei constituted, has predictive, tremendous predictive power. And if different kind of, chemists at different points in time, start out from different theories of, what chemistry is, if they do science well enough, they will all kind of converge onto that kind of thing. But there are other phenomena that don't have that kind of singular, hidden essence behind them. And they can be theorized and conceptualized differently. And this is particularly the case in psychology and psychiatry, where these phenomena are really complicated. And so the one idea simply is that, there isn't a hidden essence. We have different ways of describing, explaining, understanding these ideas. And they come with advantages and disadvantages, but one is not a, knockout winner. One doesn't displace the others. I think that's the, that's the fundamental sentiment behind explanatory pluralism, as it implies in science. This is particularly too because we are dealing with the mind-body split too. So there are theoretical perspectives that are more grounded, for example, in neuroscience, trying to look at brain circuitry and, receptor actions and, other biological processes. And then there are explanatory perspectives that are more, that utilize cognitive terms or utilize kind of, psychological, forces and unconscious psychological dynamics, etc. So we are dealing with that split kind of thing. A related idea that often comes up is that of levels of explanation, that things can be described at different, levels of organization, different levels of coherence. And that different levels invoke different kinds of, relevant concepts. So there is the physiological kind of level, neurophysiology, biology. There's kind of, cognitive stuff. There's psychological stuff. And then there's kind of, there's social interpersonal stuff, which happens, because of multiple brains interacting with each other. And so there's this idea that when things interact, new properties emerge that cannot be described adequately using concepts of the lower level. So sometimes people talk about, pluralism in the context of psychiatry and psychology, just in the sense that these phenomena transcend multiple levels and can be described at multiple levels of organization.
That's really interesting. You said a lot there that I want to unpack. So I think the first thing that made my brain go ding ding, I want to talk about that is you're talking about the periodic table of elements and the idea that there are these sort of objective things that anyone who's doing science well is going to find. So periodic table of elements, you can organize the elements in such a way that when you're going to transform an atom from one element to another. And basically anyone's going to find that. But there are other things that can only be described in with different ways of looking at them and different perspectives. I'm curious about your thought, and this is maybe getting a little philosophical really quickly, but there are a lot of like philosophers of science, for example, who might argue that even the periodic table of elements, that's like one way to look at, carbon, for example. And if we had a different set of requirements or a different set of intuitive ideas about how to interact with reality, we might find something else or structure things differently. So are you saying that, or are you what are you saying when how far does the kind of pluralism go?
Yeah. So, I mean, even in things like, physics and chemistry, or, it's a situation like periodic table, it doesn't necessarily mean that we have to rely on the standard periodic table description at all times, and other things have no role, but rather, so it's very context dependent. So there can be other theoretical ways of looking at how to think about elements or how to divide them or map them up, and there might be certain contexts, a certain situation in which you want to achieve a certain goal, and that goal is best achieved using a classification of elements that is not the one that comes from periodic table of elements, right? I don't know enough about fundamental kind of physics to theorize what they would be, but I can imagine we can theoretically imagine situations where an alternative classification offers some advantage or benefit in a particular context, right? And so we can imagine that, and in those contexts, it would be useful. It would make sense to utilize the alternative one. But the periodic table of elements possesses such immense explanatory power that the majority of situations and the majority of contexts is going to be the useful one to use. Versus there are other situations where there isn't a single perspective that dominates it in the same kind of way. Maybe like 60% of the time or something. But there are going to be significant cases, in clinical work or scientific work where we are relying and using other perspectives.
But aren't we sort of like sliding in something that's unsciency? I agree with you, but I want to present the other side of it, which is by saying that, aren't we sliding in something that's like fundamentally unsciency? Because science is really about finding those context-free, ultimately generalizable rules or facts about reality. So once you start to say, well, it's contextual, is that really the goal of science?
Philosophers of science have been thinking about these things for decades, and if not centuries, and ultimately it all comes down to some form of context or another. The reason is that we don't have direct access to whatever mind independent reality there is. So whatever the external reality is, we don't have direct access to that. We only have access to what we perceive or what we detect by means of other instrument, or by means of experiment we do. So we have to make inferences based on the data that we are gathering, and any kind of data that we are gathering, it is taking place in a certain research context or in a certain scientific context. It is guided by certain theoretical assumptions. So all observations, so philosophers often talk about all observations being theory laden, that there is no theory free observation, because any observation you're making that within a certain theoretical context, within a certain framework, within certain goals, and they can change. Now some of the most fundamental theories that we have in science, they work really well in basically all contexts that we can apply them to. And until we start encountering situations in which they don't apply. For example, like quantum physics, there's so many aspects of it that we don't understand, huge debate. But as far as empirical predictions of quantum physics are concerned, so far they have been unsurpassed. They have repeatedly proven true again and again. So so that's a really powerful theory that gives us a lot of power. So there are the fundamental theories tend to apply in all situations that we currently possess, but there would be future situations in which they may not apply. Versus then there are theoretical models that are more circumscribed in scope, that work well within certain contexts, but outside of that, they don't work very well. And this may be because they approximate something about that larger theory. Consider Newtonian kind of laws of motion. They work very well within ordinary speeds, but once we cross certain thresholds, they're not as applicable. So one way of thinking about this is in this respect. And then there are other situations in which we're simply dealing with very different kinds of phenomena. So, in physics, we have, the theory of general relativity at one end, and we kind of have quantum physics on the other end. And at the moment, physicists kind of juggle and they move back and forth between the two, depending on whether they're looking at, galaxies or whether they're looking at, external. And right now, we don't have a way of unifying them. Probably there may be a theoretical way of unifying them, but we don't know. And in a similar kind of way, we can think about theories that are examining the psyche from the perspective of, from the cognitive framework, in terms of predictive processing of beliefs. Again, these are things we are inferring because we don't, we can observe them, or we can kind of, look at these things from, from a brain circuit perspective or kind of neurotransmitter perspective. So some of it is methodological as well. Can we unify them at some point? Perhaps we would wanna, and what that would look like, we don't know, but we're not there yet.
Yeah, I agree, and it seems like probably the history of science is, like, if you go back to Newton, is finding something that we think is super general and then realizing that it's actually contextual. We just didn't have a way to access the context in which it wouldn't hold.
Yes. Yeah, exactly. Yeah, this is and there's this again. We hear these terms, the terms realism versus anti-realism in philosophy of science, which refers to the idea that these unobservable entities that we are hypothesizing, what kind of status do they have? And realism, at least the kind of naive realist view is that the unobservable entities really exist, versus kind of the anti-realistic and anti-realist kind of view would be that these are perhaps useful fictions that, we don't know what kind of reality they possess. We just know that they are useful enough that they guide our empirical work and they make predictions that turn out to be true.
Where do you fall on that continuum?
I take a more pragmatic kind of view towards these things, which, in some ways bridges the two, which it has kind of one leg in realism and one leg in anti-realism.
And you mean philosophically pragmatic, not like pragmatic, well, like the school of philosophy pragmatism?
Yes. Yeah. Yeah.
Can you just tell us, for people who don't know what that is, like generally what that is?
Yeah, it's basically it's pragmatism by itself it's a pretty broad term, but generally what it does is that it shifts the focus away from certain metaphysical questions towards our ability to make use of concepts in the world. It asks questions like what it is that we can do with a certain theoretical concept, what are its uses, how are we applying it, and it judges what a theoretical perspective is offering, or how we understand any particular phenomena based on how it is being utilized in practice.
Yeah, so it's sort of like, instead of asking, is this true? It's asking, like, is it useful for me to think of it as true? And what can I do with that if I do?
Yes. Yeah. And that's a simplistic version of that.
Yeah. There's a lot in there, but I want to get into like psychiatry, psychology. And I think like the reason that I'm so into this, other than like it's just fascinating, is just like I have OCD, and it was a mess for me to even figure that out. And it took like 10 years, and I went to a bunch of different therapists, and eventually like I was just reading a bunch of stuff and I was like, I think I have OCD. And there's a lot of debate about whether that's even helpful, right? Like for some people, the label is bad. For me, it was quite freeing because I was like, well, for OCD, typical talk therapy tends not to work that well until treatment is much better managed. And even once I had gotten into the correct treatment for it, so like exposure and response prevention, that it took me a while to get to someone who actually even practiced that well enough for it to work. And then it was a nightmare to get on medication. But once I did, it's been amazing. It like literally changed my life. I'm like a completely different person. And during that whole time, I've also just always been interested in philosophy of science stuff. I was like, the way that this works is fundamentally broken and bad. And it's bad philosophy too. Yeah. Talk to me about that.
Yeah. And actually, I think a lot of people will relate to what you're saying. And in my own clinical practice, one of the diagnoses that seems to have been missed by other clinicians a lot is obsessive compulsive disorder, OCD, where people will have histories of being treated for depression and anxiety, and yet I do a comprehensive interview and I'm like, I think you may have OCD, and suddenly like things are clicking into the place for them. And I think the reason is that for one reason, I think it's not as popular of a diagnosis in the cultural imagination as things like depression, anxiety, or ADHD. So oftentimes when here's the thing, in the psychological realm, even when we are describing, characterizing, talking about a phenomena, it is very sensitive regarding the language we use to even talk about it. So, but what happens is that if someone, for example, if a person has no idea of what OCD even is, they have never heard of it, they're not familiar with obsessions in the technical sense, they might notice that they're getting really anxious. They might notice that they're having a lot of repetitive, intrusive thoughts that kind of make them uncomfortable. One person might just think that, oh, I'm just a really nervous person, or I just have really bad anxiety, and this anxiety, and my anxiety is just causing me kind of like these kind of really nervous, anxious thoughts. Another person might think that I'm, I have some kind of paranoia. I'm getting these really weird, scary thoughts that make me kind of, uncomfortable, make suspicion. I may have paranoia or something like that. And another person just might, interpret them like, I get these racing thoughts. Maybe I have some kind of bipolar. I'm getting these weird racing there. So depending on, how the language someone might use to describe them, it might shift them in one or a different diagnostic direction. So it takes familiarity with a number of different, diagnostic, categories to begin to recognize, which direction going. So oftentimes patients themselves don't tell the clinician that I am having obsessions, because they don't use that language. They'll say, I'm anxious, I'm having nervous thoughts, etc. And it would take a somewhat astute clinician to kind of do a good interview and pick up on the fact that someone is having intrusive thoughts, and then ask further questions. So I think that's one big difficulty. But when you do have the right match, when you can match someone's presentation with this idea of OCD, you can guide them in towards the right treatments that have been studied and that are known to work better, exposure and loss prevention therapy, other forms of psychotherapies, and then medications as well. Oftentimes we were using the same kind of, serotonin-based, medications and other ones, but the dosages required are often different. Augmentation strategies are often different. So, and so you're probably familiar. There's a lot of, anti-psychiatry discussions in the mental health realm, and some people just say that, oh, we should just abandon all diagnosis. And I think how can we talk accurately about these things, without diagnostic language? And so, I feel strongly that we need more sophisticated ways of talking about these phenomena. Now, the challenge here that happens is that, we can reify that category. We can think, oh, obsessive compulsive disorder, it means that it's a thing in the brain that that explains this category. There's some kind of a singular brain dysfunction that explains all of these symptoms. And so that's where I think people go wrong if they start thinking of categories in that manner, and so OCD, as far as we know, it's not one thing. In fact, even from a symptom standpoint, it has fuzzy boundaries. So its boundaries overlap with other anxiety disorders, overlap with depression, with, other kind of things. And biologically speaking, there is no one single thing that makes OCD, but rather it's, variety of different. So we have to respect that heterogeneity, but it offers us a certain descriptive, potential. We can talk about it, we can identify it, we can use it for guiding treatment. And so this would be a good example of something that's very helpful pragmatically. It's an entity that exists from a pragmatic standpoint of view, but not from an essentialistic point of view.
But the interesting implication of the pragmatic idea is that for some people it's not helpful. And so part of being a good clinician is knowing when it is and is not helpful. And I mean, you're going to mess it up sometimes, but like that's a really interesting thing, right? Because I think the entire you've just led me into my AI into AI land. So thank you for that. I think like part of there's a lot of pressure to be able to reduce these things down into a checklist, right? That even if you don't have any clinical experience, you can just know I checked off the box. He has OCD or whatever. And I think one of the things you're saying is like, yeah, you can do the checklist, but really you need to have like a good clinician has a little bit of like a smell for it. And they're just like, I know, and I can kind of explain in this case why, but like I can't fully, but I think there's sort of scientific academic pressure to have a really clear cut theory that you can just write down this is exactly what it is. And then there's also a lot of like cost considerations and just scale considerations of if we want to make treatment available to a lot of people, then we need to be able to reduce it down into here are the rules for how to diagnose it and how to treat it, and we make basically manualized therapy, which works to some degree, but is not the same thing as with a really really skilled clinician. So to get to my AI point, these questions are exactly the kinds of questions that early machine learning researchers faced, which is like, if you want to recognize a letter, you want to do character recognition. How do we define what an A is? Do we like create a bunch of rules for it? And if so, like there's a lot of different situations in which something might be an A, but it like doesn't look at all like an A. It's very contextual. So some people went down the route of like, let's define all the rules. Which did not work. But what ended up working is deep learning, where basically what you can do is feed in a lot of examples into a neural network, and the neural network creates distributed representations of that of whatever the examples are, such that no individual neuron knows like, hey, this is an A, but altogether, basically when you feed something into a neural network, what the network is doing more or less is testing out a bunch of different hypotheses for what the letter could be and whether it could be A all at once in a non-rule like way, and then outputting, yeah, I think this is basically an A, without any individual neuron knowing the rules. But at a high level, you may be able to say like, yeah, generally if the A has a little thing at the end, then it's going to say it's an A. And so that's the basic kind of parallel I see to like machine learning stuff. I'll stop there, but there's more stuff going on there. Is that something that you've run into before or thought about? Hey there, Dan here. I wanted to take a 1-minute break from the episode to tell you about our latest sponsor. All right, let's play a game. What powerhouse productivity tool is also free for individuals? Nope, not that one. Try again. You may not expect this, but it's Microsoft Teams. Yep, the same Teams that big enterprises swear by also has a free plan for individuals. Whether you're jamming on a side project or bootstrapping a startup or building a community, Teams has all of the features that other platforms nickel and dime you for using. You can get unlimited chat, 60-minute video meetings, file sharing, and collaborative workspaces all for free. And the real magic is that everything is integrated in one seamless collaborative workspace. That means there's no more hopping between different applications for messages, meetings, and file sharing. Teams puts it all at your fingertips to save you time and money. So ditch the app overload and the subscription fatigue, and use Teams to experience effortless collaboration today. Are you ready to streamline your workflow? Head to aka.ms/every to use Teams for free. Your productivity will thank you, and so will your wallet. And now, back to the episode.
Yeah. I mean, I think there's this, there's this recognition that what we call the space of psychopathology. So this kind of this abstract conceptual space of the way symptoms are distributed in in the mental health realm. What are the ways in which this the space of psychopathology can be carved? The original kind of idea, the hope for a lot of people was that we can find single big causes, or we can find essences, and that'll provide us the way to carving this space. We can carve it, the nature at its joint kind of thing. And then now we recognize that, it's just this big, fluid, fuzzy, mess of interacting causes and mechanisms, and you can just really map it in many different ways. So we have used different strategies. Basically what the DSM-ICD etc. have been doing in over the past 50-60 years is that they have been relying on clinician observation. So they started with clinician observation and kind of refined it through operationalization, etc. There is kind of an alternative effort called HiTOP, or hierarchical taxonomy of psychopathology, and that uses more statistical techniques like factor analysis and other kind of PCA analysis to see patterns of symptom covariation. Like if you change one symptom, what symptom changes with it, and it has come up with an alternative dimensional mapping of these symptoms. But the space of how to classify them is very flexible, and there are more innovative ways you can do that. And this is where probably AI and kind of like machine learning, deep learning come in. It can help us identify new patterns and new ways of talking about the space of psychopathology that we might not have thought of ourselves. And I think people are looking into it and kind of approaching this. To my understanding, I don't think it has produced any actionable results yet. I don't think someone has come up with a new mapping that that seems very useful or that has generated. But I think in theory that's possible, and it would be exciting, to see.
Yeah, well, I think the interesting thing to me is so one is talking about like observing clinicians and then reducing how they operate to diagnostic rules. That's exactly how machine learning researchers started in AI, and it's exactly what didn't work. It does work now. Once you have a deep learning foundation, it does work now. But at the very beginning, when you're just trying to make it like a checklist of rules instead of like a sort of fuzzy pattern matcher, it does not work very well. But I think the interesting thing to me is about like factor analysis or HiTOPs or whatever is you're still trying to say like why. Okay, so like if there's like OCD is caused by some constellation of different factors, but like we can at least say what the factors are. And I think one of the interesting things to me about or one of the other interesting parallels to me about AI stuff with psychology and psychiatry is I think the development, for example, of OCD, or whether or not you're going to have OCD, or whether or not it's going to work, that question, that predictive question, is a little bit like the way, I don't know how familiar you are with the way that language models work, but it's a little bit like the way that language models work to predict the next word. So the way that a language model predicts the next word is it looks at the context of like all the words that came before it. And it's been trained that all the words that came before it each change the probability of the next word in the sequence, and each affect each other. So all the words get a chance to talk to each other, and then all the words get a chance to basically figure out what comes next. And there's no like one set of rules, and you can't really. I mean, it does learn the rules of grammar. Overall, you can look at it and be like, it knows grammar.
Yeah.
But if you're trying to understand, for example, when it might use the word OCD, that's very hard because it's so multifaceted. It's like millions and millions and millions and millions of parameters all interacting with each other to like say OCD comes next. And I think that actual OCD probably works a lot like that, or can be worked with a lot like that. Let's just say that. And the reason that we haven't done that is because in science, we prioritize explanatory power over predictive power a lot. Because in order to get your paper accepted by a journal, you have to like have a theory. And deep learning doesn't have theories. It just says, we know it works. And so my like, I don't know what it like. My stump speech is basically like we should just like throw out explanations in a lot of these cases and build predictive models with large data sets like instead of throwing 16 undergrads into a brain scanner and being like, I think of 15 minutes of meditation, like slightly affects OCD on average in these 15 undergrads, we should just like gather tons and tons and tons of both contextual data and biological data and like whatever, like chat logs, whatever, and just throw it into a deep learning model to predict when you're going to get OCD or what interventions might work or whatever, even if we don't have a theory. And I think science is generally blind to that idea.
That's a great, question and, and a great suggestion. And to my understanding is that, researchers have been trying that kind of thing in psychiatry and psychopathology for a while. And so, for example, we have had kind of people look at risk of suicide, for example, in large data sets and trying to predict, what kind of factors lead to suicide and, to what kind of accuracy we can predict the risk of suicide over a certain time frame. And there were publications that reported really, really high accuracy or really high predictive power, 90% or more in some samples. What has happened so far is that that accuracy hasn't translated very well outside the samples on which the program was trained. So a program might do very well, in a large data set, but then you take a wildly different data set and then sort of like, the kind of predictive power goes down. Now that may change in the future as the training gets better, but that's what has happened so far is that you get exceptionally good at the algorithm predict what happens in one group, but then it fails outside. And so they have tried that with, things like disease progression. If you take people at risk of psychosis, can you predict, which one would transition to psychosis? They have used development of bipolar disorder. If you take people with depression, can you predict, who will go on to have manic episodes? So I think that's where I have seen most kind of, like machine learning, deep learning kind of stuff being used. Other stuff where this is kind of happening is in kind of understanding patterns of brain circuit activation or patterns of kind of neuroimaging finding. So there were, for example, kind of a series of papers kind of last year that looked at brain circuit activation patterns in depression, anxiety, and identified various kind of subtypes that correlated with certain clinical features, etc. So that's another kind of situation where people have used. But I think we're still waiting to for this kind of methodology to deliver really kind of results that are really actionable or that work well across many contexts.
Yeah, I think my response to that, I think that's a really important let's say concern. My response to that is the same thing was true of earlier versions of text prediction or image generation. And the thing that worked was more data and more parameters and more compute. And so I'm not familiar with all of the studies that have done this, but my guess would be that what counts as a large data set in that world is actually comparatively not large to machine learning researchers who are like dealing with like terabytes of data, and that is like probably pretty small. So one is compile, like the task becomes, how do we get an actually gigantic data set? And I think a lot of the big tech companies have these data sets. If they wanted to donate them to science, I think they should. And the second thing is, I think a lot of these studies use more simplistic, underpowered statistical models that are more understandable, but end up overfitting and aren't able to represent the like complex nonlinear interactions that end up actually predicting things like suicide or depression or whatever.
Yeah, you're probably right. I think I think we're still early in this space, and that there's so much innovation happening in the, in the neural learning space. And I think it probably takes some time before these kind of methods start trickling into the clinical research space. So we probably haven't optimized, what can be achieved using that. So I agree with that. I think, there's reason to be optimistic, and there's reason not to, give up on that, but rather, continue exploring, these methods. One thing I'll say is that I think, there are things we can practically, start doing even, start exploring, even now. So, for example, one area where AI is, kind of like getting some practical application in medicine is in note writing, where there are now softwares that have been developed that kind of, listen in on the clinical encounter or the interview and generate and kind of, a template of a medical note based on what the patient and the doctor discussed, right? So that's because it's a relatively, the clinical encounter is relatively formulaic and follows a certain template. And I think it could have a lot of utility in clinical interview as well. So as you probably, recognize from your clinical experience, the average clinician is not super skilled at picking up the nuances of the presentation, right? But you could easily develop kind of an AI version of a clinical interview that, exceeds the average clinician. Someone like you, for example, let's say, could have a clinical interview that is facilitated by, a large language model. And, the language is going to have the resources, and the model is going to have the time and the resources to go into the nitty gritty of the symptoms and inquire about, clarifying, what you're experiencing, than, a rushed clinician who just has 10 minutes to talk to you in an appointment. So, I think, that's where I think, we don't even have to wait for, new scientific discoveries to talk about clinical application. If someone develops a good, clinical interview AI thing, it would be usable straight away.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, there are definitely a lot of people who are working on stuff like that, but B, I think like ChatGPT is already sort of that, to be honest. And it is kind of this interesting thing where, I mean, I go to therapy every week, and I'm a big fan of therapy, and I have a real human therapist and a real human psychiatrist. So, and I think the dream is obviously for everyone to be able to have that, and everyone to be able to have a skilled clinician. But the reality of how expensive it is to do that means that if you want to do that, that the clinician has to probably be undertrained, understaffed, have 10 minutes to talk to you, have a checklist, and is going to get things wrong more. And I think, while ChatGPT is not being billed as, a therapist, I would bet you, if you look at the way people are using it, a lot of them are using it for things that are sort of therapy-like, and that's actually probably a good thing, because it like basically democratizing access to like the most basic level of mental and emotional support means that some people won't develop problems that might have otherwise developed them. But it also becomes this sort of funnel, so that by the time you get to a therapist, maybe it's told you, hey, like here are some things you should talk to your therapist about, or whatever, that help the human clinician make progress more quickly.
Yeah. I agree. I think that there are many of my colleagues, especially in the psychotherapy world, are kind of wary of these developments, and they're looking at it with suspicion. I am more optimistic in my orientation about these things, and I generally see this as a positive development. I think it's good, and I think there are problems that are more amenable to this kind of self-directed therapy through ChatGPT, etc. And then there are other more entrenched problems that might require relationship with a human. But to the extent that there are problems that can be addressed, more in a somewhat satisfactory manner by AI, then why not? Why not utilize that? And I think a lot of people are drawn to the promise of that, and they like having more control, and they like having to, I think a lot of times clinicians can, they have all of the, quirks of humanity. They can be arrogant, they can be dismissive, they can be rushed, right? Versus ChatGPT is patient. It's all always there.
It's non-judgmental. I think a lot of people don't want to say that.
Right. Yeah. No, it's not judgmental, right? So you can use it in ways that you can manipulate it in ways that you cannot manipulate a human clinician.
I'm curious if you've used it at all for this kind of thing. Cause like for me, like, I don't know, I've been having these like stress dreams the last couple nights. And so I just record a voice note of me talking about my dream and then throw it into ChatGPT, and I have a whole like log of a bunch of dreams in the last few nights. And it's just like talking to me about different like little patterns in my psyche that I think are for real, not in a necessarily like they're predicting the future kind of way, just like in a, here's like the emotional landscape that you're in right now that might be useful for you to like have in mind as you go through your day, which it definitely has been. Or like, I often like I record all my meetings and like throw them into ChatGPT, and I'm like, I'm having a problem with this person or whatever. Like, can you walk me through like what to do about it? Versus maybe I would go to therapy, but like that's once a week, and it relies on me having to be like, well, he said this and she said this and then I said, and it's just different, you know?
Yeah, I haven't used kind of ChatGPT or Claude or anything in that, from that angle. I have mostly used it for kind of brainstorming ideas or doing kind of superficial research on some topic that I'm not very familiar with, or used it for editing, for example, if I wanted to edit a piece of writing and wanted input on how it could be worded differently or improved. So I've used it for those purposes. I have not personally used it for psychological exploration. Although this is something I should probably try as well. Well, one thing I guess since we are talking about this stuff, so if we are talking about AI applications in the classification realm, for example, right?
Yeah.
So to the extent that the process is going to be guided by by human decision making, right? It's going to be about teaching the algorithms to kind of detect, the diagnostic categories as clinicians do. But if we wanted to think about new forms of classification, how might an AI kind of, training algorithm approach that kind of thing? If we wanted it to detect or, come up with classification proposals that are different from the ones we already have.
I think it's a great question. I think the thing to think about is one is they work on examples. So if you give it a bunch of examples and ask it to you can give it a pre-existing categorization scheme and say this example is like this or this example is like that, but you can also just say, for example, predict whether or not this person will be helped by sertraline.
Okay.
And it will do its own internal classification of, sertraline or no sertraline that goes across diagnostic categories. And that we probably don't, it's super high dimensional. Like we probably very, very hard to understand. We probably could get some understanding of how it does it, but it's doing its own internal sorting. So I think the best way to get it to come up with its own categorization is to set it a task that it would require it to categorize it in a novel way. And then it will find a categorization that works for that task. Sometimes by default, that will be an internal one. But you can also get it to write out its categorization scheme or write out the reasons for why it does things in the way it does it. It takes a little bit more work to do that, but I think it's possible.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah, that's helpful. And one of the interesting things is that sometimes cultures do that. Because we have different there's cultural variations, and sometimes different cultures talk about a psychological phenomena in ways that are radically different. So so we get these kind of culture bound syndromes, for example, in the mental health realm. But a while back, I came across this cultural description of this thing called egoria, which essentially translates into self leakage. It was kind of like this idea that a person's boundary essentially has been violated in some way, and a person is, elements of their psyche are leaking out in certain ways. And then this is a way of thinking that transcends, for example, traditional psychiatric classifications, because it can cross into things like it could be delusional experiences, could be hallucinatory, but could be kind of other form, even some forms of obsessive compulsive phenomena. Sometimes cross-cultural comparisons of mental health descriptions can really be surprising, and there's like, oh wow, this is a really this is a really different take on a familiar psychiatric concept.
Yeah, I think that makes sense. The way that I think about that generally is for things like psychiatric diagnosis or classification, it's emergent. So it's we're talking about something that's super high dimensional. So any classification system is only going to, and I think you agree with this, is only going to give you like a slice or slice it in a particular way, but it's not going to be the slice. And it's a lot like musical genres. Like what really counts as rock? Might seem obvious, but if you really think about it, there's a lot of stuff there where it's like they're on the border. Like what are the Beastie Boys? Like there's some rock influences there, but they're kind of rap. They're like that kind of thing is, I think, is the same question, and you can come up with your own categorization schemes. But the question is, for what purpose? Like in order to reduce it down into a dimension that we can understand, you have to understand the purpose for which you're doing the ranking. Otherwise, the way that language models do this is they just map things into a high dimensional space. So they put like things near each other and unlike things further away, but in across many dimensions. And they don't have a huge dictionary of each thing that or they don't have a full map of each thing. What they do is you give it a thing, and then it generates its location in that space. And once you have its location, then you can kind of say like, well, it's near this or it's not near this. And that's how you get away with not having a universal understandable categorization scheme. You just map it in a space that allows for thousands and thousands of different dimensions.
Yeah, it's all really fascinating.
Yeah. Anyway, this is fantastic. If people are interested in reading more about reading more of your work, where can they find you?
The place where I'm most active these days is my Substack newsletter, Psychiatry at the Margins. So that's where I'm kind of talking about various kinds of controversies in the field and various debates and other developments that are taking place. I'm also present on X/Twitter, on Blue Sky, and as you mentioned in the beginning, recently there was a volume published by Oxford University Press called Conversations in Critical Psychiatry, which is an edited collection of interviews that I had done for Psychiatric Times. So I encourage people to check that out too if you're interested in various debates in the field. So I think Substack and other social media platforms probably the best.
Awesome. Thank you so much. Keep doing what you're doing. It was really great to talk to you.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
Absolutely positively have to smash that like button and subscribe to AI and I. Why? Because this show is the epitome of awesomeness. It's like finding a treasure chest in your backyard, but instead of gold, it's filled with pure, unadulterated knowledge bombs about ChatGPT. Every episode is a roller coaster of emotions, insights, and laughter that will leave you on the edge of your seat, craving for more. It's not just a show. It's a journey into the future with Dan Schipper as the captain of the spaceship. So do yourself a favor, hit like, smash subscribe, and strap in for the ride of your life. And now, without any further ado, let me just say, Dan, I'm absolutely, hopelessly in love with you.